Shalom לכולם. I think this is almost all I can speak in Hebrew, so I'll ask for your forgiveness. Before I start that small presentation, I think that as a French diplomat in front of an Israeli audience, I cannot but start with a very sad foreword about what happened in Toulouse yesterday. I'm sure you all saw the drama that happened there and the entire mobilization of the French nation. In just about 1 hour, the President has ordered that a minute of silence is respected all the French schools, and it means all the French schools in France, but it will also mean all the schools, the French-speaking schools here in Israel, so that we commemorate. And if there is one sentence before we join that we join backspace, is the entire dedication of the French nation as a whole, all political parties together, to stand united in front of what is a horrific murder. Not everything is clear, but you can be sure of one thing, is that we have deployed all the means that we have in our hands to find the murderers and to bring them to justice. I'm sorry to start with that sad note, but this is a very special day. I had to fight a lot to be here with you this morning because, as you can imagine, there are a lot of things to do in France and also here because some of these were Israeli as well and will be probably buried here in the coming days. So with that sad note, I will come back to the presentation and try to give some space and bring us back above our heads and above ground for a couple of minutes to talk about an issue that I've been dealing with over the last years, which is space security and sustainability of long-term space activities. I will talk about this issue through a different angle than what you have heard over the morning, which is a more political and diplomatic angle, of course. Just one note is it's not, the whole French policy is also deeply rooted in technology, science, industry, but I will only focus here on the political and diplomatic side of our policy to secure space and space activities, but always happy to answer any question you might have. I will start by coming back to a number of things that were presented to you this morning through a different angle, and I think why space security has become a political issue and a policy issue much more than it was. It used to be just 3, 4, 5 years ago. It's because the conjunction of 3 parallel trends. The first one is here. It's the growing awareness in the society and in the political class of our countries, and especially of our Western countries, of 3 main elements. The first one is this one. This is very evident, but I think it has come to the awareness of the public and the political class just recently. The fact that space has become an absolutely critical asset for every aspect of our modern societies and economies. It used to be an issue for experts, for science, for defense, for security, but now it has become something absolutely critical for every aspect of our daily life. Telecommunication, finance, economy, whatever. Name one issue, one aspect of our daily life, and you're absolutely sure to find a space dimension to it. This is developing. This will continue to develop and grow. But in parallel, of course, people start to realize that a lot of things they do on their daily life are more and more dependent on the availability and the long-term availability and the guarantee of availability of space capacities. And so with space becoming more and more a critical asset for our modern societies, there is also a greater understanding that we are fully dependent on space systems for civilian and defense purposes, and so that we are more vulnerable than we used to be a few years ago. Those 3 elements go hand in hand. These are critical assets. We are more and more dependent on them, and so we are more vulnerable if those space assets are not any longer available for our daily life. And I'm not talking here about our defense, just our defense needs and objectives. It's a long time since our military are used to rely on space assets for conducting their mission. But now I cannot think of any aspect of our daily life where there is no space assets. And this element, this first trend, has become more and more a key element of our reflection and thinking when it comes to national security in all its aspects. Second element of this growing awareness at the political level is what Ganit resumed and what the Americans call the 3C, that I put it in a different way, but that's the same idea. At the same time where we are more dependent and more vulnerable, space is becoming a very different place than it used to be. It's a place where there is a lot of competition. I think there are almost 60 spacefaring nations, however you qualify them, with some kind of space capacity and space assets. So there are a lot of nations up there and fighting not just for having their share of space, but also for their economy, for developing their own economy nationally, I mean. So we are much more present in space altogether. As a result, there is a lot of congestion in space. There is heavy traffic in space. It's a bit like a road that has become extremely congested. I've been living in Tel Aviv for 2 years, so I can have a good idea of what it is to be congested on the roads in space. So we have also to face this, and this has nothing to do with defense or intentional threats. This is just the fact that as we are more and more present in space, there are more and more risks for what we do in space. Just like when we are on the road and we are heavy traffic, there are more risks than when we are alone. Third element, of course, is the question of the space debris, and it's a result of the two first elements. We are more and more in space. This is a very competitive field where we want to be the first, and when we wanted to be the first over the last decades. And so we have altogether created a lot of debris that now poses a great deal of threat to every kind of assets that we have there. And eventually, and I put it at the end because usually when we speak about space security, we think first of assets and man-made threats. And I would just like to put them in perspective because there are many other threats that are also man-made but not intentional. Maybe I should have called that last bullet point differently. I mean intentional versus unintentional threats. And of course, yes, because this is a great competition worldwide, there are also intentional man-made threats. So all these different elements, competition, congestion, debris, man-made, intentional, non-intentional threats, have also created a growing awareness among our political masters that space is important, space is vulnerable, and so we have to do something about space and space security. The third trend that explains that whole issue has become a real political and policy issue is rooted in a number of very recent events. I just listed them. I'm sure you know absolutely all of them. It started with the Chinese ASAT test. I was in Washington at the time, and I can assure you that was a wake-up call. I was in Washington for 1.5 years at that time. I've never heard about space security, and I was doing defense and Paul Mill and security and all that stuff. I haven't heard about space security before in the Congress. Suddenly, from day one to the day after, everybody was speaking about space security and long-term sustainability of space activities. So it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call for us also in France. And then you have a number of other events that reminded everybody that space was a competitive space, congested, with a lot of actors having different intentions and posing risks to our assets. The US interception with the SM-3 that I think Ofer mentioned earlier, the collision between an Iridium satellite and a Cosmos 1, and then a number of maneuvers that the ISS had to do, that we had to do with our own assets to avoid these clouds of debris. And I'm just speaking here about things that are in the public domain. So you have those three trends in parallel. You have the fact that you have an event, a number of incidents and events that recall, that bring to the attention of our political leaders that space is at threat and that they have to do something. There is the growing realization and understanding that space is more and more a critical asset for us, and that all the internal developments in the space industry and space business makes everybody understand that something needs to be done. I think that was Ophir's conclusion in the presentation. And so the question now I'd like to go to is, so what needs to be done? For us, I mean, we are France. We are a spacefaring nation for decades now, with, I think, the full spectrum of capabilities, civilian, defense, technology, science, whatever. But it's also true that we integrated the notion of space security in our national security doctrine just recently. And there are two elements for us that are critical in the development of our own policy vis-à-vis space security. And those two are in parallel. That was when, just a few months after Sarkozy was elected, he went to Kourou in the space port that we have in French Guiana there, that is now a European spaceport, and he made a big speech on space policy, covering everything, science, technology, but also space security. And I'll come back, and those three main principles that you see here are for the first time mentioned in that speech by the President in February 2008. And it was also developed a lot in a big review that we conducted at the beginning of Sarkozy's term, what we call the White Paper on Defense and National Security, that covers everything related to national security, but there is a big space component in it, where we thought a lot about what it takes to secure our space assets and what kind of policy we should have to make sure that those space assets that we are heavily dependent on will continue to be reliable for us. The summary of that thinking is three. You will say that those are very, very basic principles. I mean, that's just good sense, but that's different to say it and to put it at the core of your policy when you're a nation and a government. Those three main principles, and you'll see afterward that we have incorporated them in the initiative that we took at the end of 2008 in the European Union, are very basic principles. We want to have free access to space for peaceful purposes. Full stop. We want to preserve the integrity and the security of our satellites in orbit, and more than that, to our space systems as a whole. And this is also very important, we want to maintain our legitimate right of self-defense. And there are a number of elements that pertain to that principle. So those three main principles are really at the core of the French space policy and space security policy. Now, to come to that key question, we decided, we were not alone, of course, but as a nation we decided that an international code of conduct for space activities was a good answer. Not the full answer, but the good answer for some of the problems we faced. And so what are the objectives for an international code of conduct, and why an international code of conduct for space activities? The first point is that there already exist a number of international norms, treaties, agreements, declarations, statement of intentions. I will not list them, but we already have a number of treaties. So the first reaction we had was, well, is it worth starting a full, lengthy negotiation of a new international treaty? And if so, what kind of treaty, what kind of definition, for what purposes, what do we do with that? And that was exactly at the moment where our Russian friends and the Chinese were putting forward the PPWT. And we were not entirely sure that that was the best answer to all the problems that I described to you before. We came to the conclusion that a slightly different approach was preferable, and that we needed an approach based on confidence and confidence building and transparency measures, kind of what a number of think tanks in Washington called rules of the road, and of course the Stimson Center that launched the idea many years ago. What does that mean? It means something that will be more informal, non-legally binding, so a non-binding agreement, instrument, and that could also be an answer to one of the resolutions that was adopted in the UN in December 2006, precisely calling for transparency and CBMs in outer space activities. So we thought that that approach of a more informal but very specific in substance, I'll come back to that, was preferable to a lengthy international negotiation of a treaty that would trigger a number of very difficult questions, very difficult to solve, especially in the question of definitions. And also we thought that because space is becoming more competitive, more congested and everything, that was also a good initiative to enhance cooperation among spacefaring nations. And we as a nation, we have decided, of course, as the Americans have discovered recently, that international cooperation when it comes to space is good. We have done that before because we have no choice. But on top of that, we have decided that this is absolutely indispensable. We have a good cooperation with our Israeli friends. The head of the French Space Agency was here as the guest speaker for the Ilan Ramon conference a few weeks ago, and we try to, I think, no, we don't try. We will succeed in opening a new chapter in our bilateral cooperation. But it is about technology, science, R&D, industry. But it's also good to cooperate on political and diplomatic aspects as well when it comes to space security. You cannot base your security just on technology or R&D. You have to have a political and diplomatic process. And the idea of initiating an informal or non-binding instrument in the form of a code of conduct will also be a useful tool to enhance international cooperation and discussion amongst big spacefaring nations. So why such an initiative? It's rooted, we do not pretend to have invented everything from scratch. There was a debate in the think tanks community, in the experts community before, about rules of the road, code of conduct, name it as you wish. And I mentioned the Stimson Center in Washington. There was also a number of discussions at technical and experts level in the UN bodies, especially the COPUOS discussions about debris mitigation guidelines, space operations guidelines, long-term, and what was called at the time long-term sustainability of space activities, that was initiated by a former head of the French Space Agency, Gérard Brachet. That was a good initiative to pave the way in the COPUOS for what became, at the end of the second semester 2008, a European initiative of a draft code of conduct for space activities. We had the presidency of the European Union in the second semester 2008, and we used that opportunity to foster and to propose to our European partners and then to the rest of the world a code of conduct. Why? Because we are a spacefaring nation, because Europe as a whole, with the European Space Agency, with a number of other European spacefaring nations, we collectively are a major player in space. And so we have a specific interest as a nation, as France, but also as Europe, to make sure that we develop instruments for better space security and better sustainability of our space operations. And the last bullet is very important. It started as a European initiative, but it's not any longer. Because we are not interested in having a European Union code of conduct. We are interested in having an international code of conduct. We are not the only one to be active in space. There are a lot of other players, of course. So we want to move from just a European initiative to an international initiative, to an international code of conduct that would be agreeable by almost, if not all, the spacefaring nations. Now I come to the substance of what a code is. I don't know if you have read the draft code of conduct. Actually, there are two versions. One that was adopted by the European Union in December 2008, and one that was adopted, a revised version that was adopted after a long series of international consultations in October 10. There are slight differences. I won't enter the details of the differences between the two versions, but this is a public document. I strongly encourage you to go on the web and look for it. It was adopted on October 11th, 2010. by the European Union, and it is proposed to the rest of our international partners. I won't enter all the details, but I will just give you the headlines of the different chapters and elements of the code. First, what is the purpose, the scope, and the core principles of the code? The very first sentence of the code is, the purpose of this code is to enhance the security, safety, and sustainability of all outer space activities. And you found in that first chapter that speaks about the principles and the purpose, things that will ring a bell in terms of freedom for all states to access, explore, and use outer space and to exploit space objects for peaceful purposes. There is also in that code the mentioning of the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense in accordance with the United Nations Charter. And here this is really the core when it comes to the principles and the purpose, the responsibility of states to take all the appropriate measures and cooperate in good faith to prevent harmful interference. And this is really, I think, the core objective and the core principle that those two words, those three words, prevention of harmful interference in outer space activities. This is really the foundation of the code and its objective. Everything that is in the code has as an objective to prevent harmful interferences in outer space. It encourages all states to adhere to all the main international norms that already exist. There is a long list, I won't go into it, but if all states were to adhere and abide by the existing norms, we would already be a bit better in terms of space security. Now when it comes to the space operations, there is a whole chapter about space operations. What do we need to do as spacefaring nations to make sure that our space operations are conducted in a safe and secure manner and do not harm, intentionally or not, other space activities. There are a few principles here and a few commitments by the subscribing states of that code. The first one is that each state would refrain from any action which intends to bring about directly or indirectly damage or destruction of outer space objects. So basic principles, nothing that would bring about or damage outer space objects. And there are three exceptions that are very important because we live in the real world, not in the world of principles and fantasy where diplomats sometimes live. And those three exceptions are that if actions are taken to bring about objects, for example, it has to be conducted to reduce the creation of outer space debris, first element, or it has to be justified by the inherent right for collective or individual self-defense. So we take into account that we have defense needs also. And it has to take into account critical safety considerations. This very basic principle is kind of a commitment from the spacefaring nations to minimize the risk of collision, of course. In the way we conduct our space operations, we need to minimize the risk of collisions, and we need to abide by the different best practices, I would say. Next element in the code, a number of measures that are related to space debris control and mitigation. A commitment by all the states and all the spacefaring nations that would subscribe to that code to refrain from the intentional destruction of any on-orbit space object that could create long-lived space debris. And, of course, the reference to the guidelines that were adopted in the UNGA Resolution 62-217, so that states that would subscribe to the code would recommit to respecting, abiding by those debris control and mitigation best practices that were discussed in Vienna especially. But these principles are not, they are important reminders, and they are elements that we have to take into account when conducting space operation, but this is not the only dimension of the code. Because the code also provides for cooperation mechanisms that are also very important. when you act in space, you have to make sure that you will notify your space, or generally speaking, that you will notify your space activities. It can be scheduled maneuvers, pre-notification of the launch of space objects. It can be a notification of a collision, of incident, a breakup, a satellite that becomes decommissioned, or that stops working. So you have to notify your partners that you have something there that might create problems. You have to notify them also of predicted high-risk re-entry, for example, events that might happen. Or you have to simply warn your partners that you might have a malfunctioning asset in space orbit that could result in a risky re-entry maneuver. So there is an element here where, and this is the core of the transparency part, you have to notify your partners of what you do in space so that they can adjust their own space operations for not creating debris, for maintaining their space operations safely, and so on and so forth. You have, of course, to registrate space objects. Here there already exists a number of norms and international guidelines, but we put that here as a recommitment of the states and to have an all-encompassing code of conduct that would not put aside any element. And the two last elements are also very important in terms of information sharing. We thought that it would be good to have an international mechanism where the member states could discuss and talk about a number of things. First, their space policies. I don't know of many arenas worldwide where space can really talk in depth about their space policies and strategies, and including their basic objectives for security and defense. For example, this is something that we have included in the code. What we would like is to have a forum where the different member states that would subscribe to the code could talk about their space policy and strategy, but including in the security and defense arena. And you can imagine a number of countries where we would love to have more information about their policy and strategy when it comes to the use of space for security and defense purposes. I mean, we are very transparent, generally speaking, in the Western world. I mean, we put everything that we do in space in the white paper on national defense and security. The Americans, they have their space strategy. The Europeans generally, but I mean, not all of the spacefaring nations are that transparent. So that would be good to have this forum to talk about that. That would be good also to have a forum to talk about the procedure to prevent and minimize the possibility of accidents, collisions, or any form of harmful interference. Place where we can talk about the policies to reduce and prevent the harmful interferences, and a number of elements. So there is an important element here about talking not just about incidents and events, but about policy and strategy, so that we understand better why this state is doing this at this moment in space. Because over the last, for example, all the incidents that I listed, not all, but a number of them, we discovered them either with our own space situational awareness assets or in the press. This is not when you are spacefaring nations. I mean, you don't really like to discover that something is happening in space just by reading the newspapers or by reading the result of your radar or different assets. It's better if you have previous notification and if you have a forum where you can discuss and understand why this incident happened at that point. And the last bullet point here about the consultation mechanisms is precisely the formalization in the Code of Conduct of a regular, at least once a year, a meeting of the subscribing of the member states of the Code that would talk about all this. I mentioned also that in the consultation mechanism we have provided a specific disposition here that talks about something that will probably take time to be put in place, what we call a mechanism to investigate proven incidents affecting space objects. The idea here, I think it will take time. The code will probably, we hope that the code, when it will be adopted, will provide the basis for a discussion on what this inspection mechanism could be. This is a bit of a tricky proposal. The basic idea is simple. Something happened in space or about our space systems. We don't know exactly what it is. Is it related to space environment? Is it man-made? Is it intentional? Is it unintentional? A lot of questions arise. Nobody really understands what happened. as for now, there is nothing internationally. Each state, with its own assets, try to understand and basically through the intel channels, talk among close members, what they have seen, what they understand, they compare notes or whatever. Here, what we are trying to imagine, but you see that it is sensitive, is an international mechanism where the different volunteering states could bring their own assets. We could have a roster of experts that could collect, of course, the public available data. Don't think that any reasonable people believe that this mechanism would have access to intel, but that could collect the available data and talk and have an expert opinion, collective expert international opinion of what happened. So this will take time probably to be put in place, but this is something that is dear to our heart because we sincerely believe that this is also an element of international cooperation that will bring about more confidence and more transparency, and so where spacefaring nations will be more at ease to conduct their space operations in a peaceful, safe and secure way. The point I just forget about when it comes to information about member states, and it's about the consultation mechanism, it's also that pursuant to the code, when it is adopted, if a state at some point believes that there is harmful interferences to its space operations, it will have the right to ask for a meeting within the permit of the code to precisely talk about that incident, gain the cooperation of the other members of the Code of Conduct, the subscribing states, and start a discussion, international discussion with all the players so as to understand and so as to stop the harmful interference. Where are we now in terms of diplomatic maneuver, which are from time to time more difficult than space maneuvers? As Ganit mentioned, there was a very important decision by the US government in January or in 2012 to fully support an international space of conduct. I mean, we decided to take that sentence in the statement that the US government fully supports an international space code of conduct. It's not an easy decision by the US government. I mean, I know it firsthand. Because it's a big change in the U.S. policy. I will not enter all the details because I'm French, I'm not American, but as a foreigner that has watched the evolution of the space policy over the last years, I think this is a very significant move from the U.S. administration here. And this is, of course, an absolutely critical element if we want our draft international code of conduct to gain momentum. Without the U.S., we have no chance of pushing forward an international space code of conduct. Now that they are fully on board, this is a bit better for us. But of course, you know the internal difficulties. There was a number of hearings over the last weeks in the Congress. So there is a lot of sensitivity, politically speaking, in Washington about international norms, whatever. Even if they are not norms, but rules of the road, best practices, there is sensitivity. We strongly argue that there is nothing in the code that is not already implemented by the U.S. administration and by a number of spacefaring nations as best practices. So that's a very important move. And now the very next steps after the consultation that the European Union as such conducted over the last years between 2008 and 2012, basically, that explained the difference between the 2008 version and the 10 version of the Code of Conduct. Now we are moving towards a new phase where we hope that probably this year we'll be able, after a number of experts meeting, to put together the main spacefaring nations and have a formal international conference that will finalize the code and adopt it formally. If you know the HCOC, the Hague Code of Conduct for Ballistic Missiles, this is a bit the kind of, not something that you mostly like here in this country, but that's another story. This is a bit of the diplomatic process that we have in mind. So in the coming weeks and months, we really intend, as Europe, with the Americans, with the other, with the Russian and Chinese, to have a number of pretty discrete expert meetings and consultations to finalize the draft International Code of Conduct, and then hopefully to have it adopted in the coming month so that we will have an instrument. Just a last and concluding sentence here. You see that this is not the absolute tool that will make space operations safe and secure. This is one very significant and important element when it comes to political and diplomatic initiative that can bring about real change, more transparency, more confidence among spacefaring nations, but it will of course not solve all and each and every problem that we'll continue to face in space today. But it is our strong belief that with such an initiative we'll be a bit better off when it comes to the long-term sustainability of our space activities and to our space security. Thank you so much. תודה רבה.